Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, I've been staying with Ramo and Lakani and Ethan, and it's been kind of nice. I see parents interacting with their kids, and it reminds me of being a kid to a certain extent. Kind of Ethan's. We went out and we found this hidden Nazi fort that is actually in Narrabeen. What's it called? Narrabeen. It's in the forest by Eleanor Heights. It's a real thing. The Gestapo used to live there. And I was feeling pretty amazed and kid-like, but a little bit scared, finding this hidden fort in the forest. And I remember, as a young man, can kind of see when a child has Buddhist parents, then they get inculcated in Buddhist values. I visited this other family, and they just had a newborn baby, and they're playing paritas for the baby. So, like, right when he's a young guy, he already hears the sound of paritas. Like, we were playing them in the womb. You kind of hear that from the time you're a really young kid. And when I was growing up, my mother was really, really into science. So rather than hearing like Buddhist stories, she would come and tell me, oh, they found this new study. This new study says you should eat this type of food. Okay. Well, they're still doing those studies, I think. It's still coming up with new types of food people have to eat. And then you'd hear, okay, science says this about this and this. So I grew up with this very rational way of looking at the world. I didn't really have much of a mystical bent at all. And my mother's partner, he was going for his philosophy PhD. So as a young man, he would kind of argue with me. That's the thing, older men will teach the skills that they know to younger men. So sometimes they'll take you out and play baseball if you're a little guy, or frisbee, or whatever it might be. They'll teach some skills. I went upstairs today and I heard Ramo teaching Ethan how to use, this is how you drag and drop the computer. Little did I know he was making a special card for me. I thought it was a school project. But this gentleman, he was very good at philosophy, so what he would teach was how to argue. So he'd be like, what do you think about this, Joseph? Kind of like, give me a little bit of an argument. What do you think about that? What do you think about this? So I grew up with this view of looking at the world in an objective manner and really trying to test things out, and really believing that what I was looking for in terms of what was important was something external. It was something outside. I was talking to people the other day. I can't actually remember. It's been nice being here in Australia. You have the chance to meet all these different Buddhist groups. And the values that Western culture especially tends to place on the people who grew up there is that you are valued by your ability to manipulate the external world. How well you can manipulate it generally determines what potentially kind of job you can have. The higher paying jobs are ones in which you manipulate a larger section of the world. Become a manager, now you're manipulating 4 or 5 or 6 or 10. Or there's one guy who became a monk, he had 300 employees, and so he's manipulating a big section of his company, manipulating the world in this way. And doing it in such a way that it makes things more physically comfortable, which is not necessarily bad. So when you grow up with this idea behind you that science is important, and that manipulating the world is important, and that what you get externally is important, what it tends to incline your mind towards is to searching for truth outside. What is it that's true externally? What's real externally? And what's fake externally? What really is reality? And what is the world really like? So I think they're still talking about this. They've been talking about it for a long time, and the talk hasn't slowed down. Still going on, and it tends to lead to a lot more talk. In Indian philosophy, especially in Buddhist philosophy, the focus was different. In Greek philosophy, the focus was on the I. So, almost all Western philosophy is based on Greek philosophy and later philosophers who based themselves on them. And there were definitely mystical elements, but what we inherited, especially from Aristotle, was a focus essentially on the I. I think it was Are these things real? Is the external world real or not? What can we see with the eye? And what can we know with the eye, essentially? In Indian philosophy, which is where Buddhism comes from, the focus wasn't on the eye, it was on essentially the stomach. Where can we find a source of food that will last as long as we need it? So what we have is a divergence in these two philosophical systems in terms of what they're looking at, and in terms of what they're looking for, and in terms of where they think they'll find meaning. In the scientific philosophical system, what they're looking at is what's outside. And what's meaningful is how you can manipulate things outside. In the Indian philosophical system, especially that the Buddha represented, they're looking inside. How can we find a permanent source of something to feed on? How can we find a permanent source of food? Now, when people come to Buddhism, in part from a Western background, but not only from a Western background, the question of where to look and what to look at plays an enormous role in whether they'll be successful or not in being happy. This plays a huge role. And it's often a question that is not even asked. What is the purpose for which I'm doing this? But when we think about the purpose for which we look for anything, there's no higher purpose for any search that we do in our life than to be happy. Actually, this is the meaning of our life. It's the big question at the center of our life. How can I become happy? What is it that will make me happy? So in science, the quest was always, how can we make the world as comfortable as possible, right? Like if I could only, make the world a little bit more comfortable, then I would be happy. And even the scientific systems that the West has developed to make the world as comfortable as possible have a recognition that to a certain extent, this is just not going to work. So I remember when I was a young man, I took economics. I kind of don't know if anybody else here has taken economics. A show of hands. You have? Yeah. Anybody? Lalit, you took? No. Lakani took economics. So in economics, one of the very first things that they teach you is that resources are scarce and desires are infinite. And so the role of economics is how to learn to manage scarce resources, to try to fulfill infinite desires. And what they also recognize is that the satisfaction that you get from things tends to go down over time, tends to diminish over time. It doesn't stay the same. So today I had some Swiss chard. It was very good for my stomach, good for my body. And if I ate another cup of Swiss chard, okay, first cup was, yeah, this is good. It's been 8 hours or whatever since I've eaten. Longer than 8. How long till monks? 12 hours. Long time. From 12 till, no, more than that. 16 hours. Okay, my math is going up. The amount of time since I've eaten. So if you fasted for a long period of time, then when you go to eat, the very first bite is absolutely, yeah, this is really good. Really, really delicious. This is excellent. And feels good for the body. Now, if Ramon Lakani came down with another pot of Swiss chard and I ate that, it would, okay, yeah, this is okay. They came down with a third pot, I'd be like, oh, this is a little painful. And if I saw them coming with a fourth pot, I might try to run away and get out of the back door or something. That's enough. I can't eat anymore. So what this is called in economics is the law of diminishing returns. In other words, the more that we get of something, the less satisfying it becomes. And so we need to switch to something else. We need to switch to a different thing to get a new level of satisfaction. So that's the best that science has come up with, is to develop a system in which we can try to switch what we consume as quickly as possible. To search for the next thing so that our happiness will not diminish from what's outside. Now there's another interesting aspect to this external type of happiness, which is built in to our ability to enjoy it. And that is that happiness that comes from external things depends on not having them. So that's built in to this law of diminishing returns. If we want to enjoy anything that exists outside of us, we enjoy it because we didn't have it. When we have it, we don't enjoy it. So there's always a contrast that exists in our ability to take enjoyment from the external world. And in Buddhism, the Buddha encapsulates this in a very succinct, very powerful way in this teaching on the 8 worldly winds. Gain follows on loss, pleasure follows on pain. Repute follows on disrepute. And I can't remember the last one now. I'm really bad at remembering all the various lists in the suttas. But the basic principle is that each of these things have their opposite built into it, and they spin after each other. Because our ability to enjoy whatever it is that's external to us depends on our not having it. So there is a trick built into this. Now when the Buddha describes what the source of suffering is, he calls it craving. So now searching here, now searching there, seeking ever fresh delight, always looking for ever fresh delight. So when we try to manage the external world, we can manage it in ways that are nice. Actually, it's been really good to come here to Australia. I had this kind of wound on my foot, and I started eating good food, and the wound closed. I started eating like Swiss chard and things, and I had this wound on my toe that was open for like a week. I was like, I don't think this is a good thing. Came here, it closed. So it is nice to have these kind of external conditions that we can manipulate. But the question is, where do we actually search for that value? Where do we actually place the weight of where we think it is that will find happiness? And this question, because it isn't asked very often, is often answered in a way that's subconscious. It's answered in a way that's unspoken. And sometimes it's not answered by us. It's answered sometimes by people who've told us things in the past that we might have heard, when we were really young or when we were a teenager or whatever else it might have been. They were just in the atmosphere and we took them and picked them up and went with them. So as a young man, again, there was a time when in grade 7, my grade 7 teacher, she asked the class, she said, what do you guys think the purpose of happiness is, or purpose of life is? And I put up my hand, I was like, happiness is the purpose of life. She said, no, not the purpose of life. So I became totally and completely convinced that happiness was the purpose of life, but I didn't know anything about religion. So I thought, well, science, you come up with theories. I'm going to come up with a theory of how to be happy. Like, what's the best theory that I can come up with? So then I gathered evidence. I kind of started to get all this evidence together. Okay, who's happy? Who looks happy? Who was happy in the 5th grade? We were in grade 2, I think, right? At that time I was in grade 7. So who was happy in the 5th grade? How was I happy in the 5th grade? Oh, it was the people who were popular in the 5th grade who seemed the happiest. That was the perception I had. Okay, who's happy in high school? It's the people who are popular in high school who seem the happiest. Okay, who's happy when they're an adult? It's the people who have like good jobs and a lot of money who seem happy when they're an adult. Those are the people who are happy. Okay, who's happy when they retire? So I ended up with this theory where essentially to be happy, you had to try to ride this crest from each phase of life where you were always on the top. It's a very materialistic theory because that was the evidence that I could gather with my eye. And with my eye, I could see, or what I felt that I could perceive, was that these people were the happiest. And actually, in a sense, if all a person looks at is external things, that can be true to a certain extent. If it's just about what people are consuming, usually whoever has the highest level of consumption in a society at that particular phase, they generally have the most command of sensual pleasures and are generally the happiest. So this theory went on, and I went to high school, so here we go, entering the high school phase. Better try to become as popular as possible. Like right at the top of the high school hierarchy, and see what we can do with that and kind of get to the top. And okay, next phase, you got to go to university. But I figured I'd spend a good amount of time partying before going there. So after getting into high school and trying really hard to do these things and having a number of kind of like adventures in high school, I did get into this kind of like popular group of kids. And it was an interesting thing. You kind of get into this popular group of people at the top of high school. And you gain the ability, if you're in a group that controls a certain amount of material and social resources to block other people from joining. And you also gain the ability to let people in. So what it means is that if you climb to like the top of a mountain peak, you can do a pretty good job of staying there, actually. And getting to the top is kind of hard. Once you stay there, it's more like a maintenance type thing. You just have to maintain it. The problem was that high school comes to an end. That phase of life comes to an end. And then the people who were very popular in high school, who were very attractive and beautiful and very good social skills, they usually didn't get that good marks in high school. They usually weren't the people who studied really hard and went to good universities and got good jobs. And so what tended to happen after that, there was another phase where people were going night clubbing until their 20s or so, but then doing that for a while, their appearance started to change, they didn't have as much money, and they were no longer the people at the top. They could no longer guard the summit at the top. So seeing this, one can get a little bit dismayed. Kind of climb to the top, but the mountain will eventually crumble. Eventually, work, however high one gets in one's career, one will have to retire. And actually, there was this person who asked me on Zoom the other day, so what do you do when you retire and people stop respecting you as much? well, you got to put your weight on something other than your job. Because when you retire, then yeah, I mean, you're not at the top of this ability to control things, so people respect you less. So, thinking about this, I didn't really have a good answer to how to find happiness outside. And searching for it in these ways could lead to some pretty unusual and unfortunate consequences. And then my mother gave me this book as a joke. It was called If the Buddha Dated. So I mean, as a Buddhist, you would never write a book with that title. Western people at the time would write a book with that title. It was meant as a joke, because I used to argue with my friend's mother, who was a Christian, and I'd tell her I was a Buddhist just to start the argument off. I was just that kind of little annoying kid who liked to poke people from different philosophies and religions. So in this book, I was reading through it and came to a section in which it said, this is the central teaching of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. And I remember reading through these teachings and I was like, well, I can't really argue with this at all. It's something that I can't argue with. I can't deny this. So I finished reading that particular section of the book, and by the time I finished, I was a Buddhist. I like these stories in the Pali Canon where you have somebody who thinks they're really smart, like this really skilled debater, they go to argue with the Buddha, and then instead of that, they end up getting converted and being his disciple. So whatever I could come up with, I mean, I'm not Einstein, I'm not some kind of genius in terms of my ability to use the principles of reason to find some permanent source of happiness in the external world. I just couldn't find it. And I couldn't find it in the philosophies that taught about where to find happiness in the external world. So when we come to Buddhism as well, when we come to practice the Buddhist teachings, this principle and this divide between how we look at the purpose of our engagement with the Buddhist teachings, again, can do a lot to determine whether the Buddhist teachings make us happy, whether they make us neutral, or whether there's something that doesn't really make much difference at all. So sometimes when we come to the Buddhist teachings, it's actually to look for truth externally. I was talking to Ramo in the car the other day, and we were talking about how the Pali Canon has gaps in it. There's like gaps in its descriptions of the external world. Actually, if you look at something like just dependent origination, again, everybody here has studied that well, it doesn't really do a very good job necessarily of explaining what happens when you like walk into a room. I remember trying to go through dependent origination. It's like, okay, I'm walking into the room, what's happening? Trying to go through all the links. Well, it's not just adding up. Like it doesn't add up. And I thought, well, the 5 aggregates would be a better explanation of what happens when you walk into a room. You could use those more thoroughly. So when we come to look at the Buddhist teachings to try to find truth outside, as if the Buddha was explaining a reality outside, and that this is what we have to realize, it starts to seem like there's gaps in the suttas. It starts to seem like there's gaps in his teachings. And what we take away from it are little pieces. Right? A little piece of reality here, there's the 5 aggregates. A little piece there, there's the 6 sense spaces. A little piece there, ignorance is the cause of rebirth, right? Well, these little kind of like pieces from the Buddhist teachings. So if that is what we're looking for, then our investigations will tend to try to go beyond what the Buddhist taught in the Sutta Pitaka into other types of teachings. Like, okay, how do mind states actually arise? What factors are there in the mind states? Sometimes I go to monasteries, and it can be useful to have this kind of knowledge. But I hear people, and they're kind of like memorizing like these huge lists. Kind of like, okay, what's the first one? Okay, you got this and this and this and this, and it keeps going. It's like 26, a big list, and the lay people got to repeat after that. And then they go home, they have this idea of what reality is, but what has it done? And kind of go further, and then think a little bit further. Okay, the Buddha's taught about not self. There's no self in the world. And what does that knowledge do? What does it cause us to seek? It tends to cause us to look for a very special experience in where we experience that there's no self. In which we come to realize the reality of suffering, or in which we come to realize the reality of impermanence, like we have some experience that shows all of that to us. When we turn around and look at the way that the Buddha actually taught, and apply his teachings not for the purpose of an external knowledge, but for the purpose of finding a good source of food, then the whole relationship changes. So again, I was talking to Ramo, and Ethan is doing a lot of like swimming lessons. I see him, he comes out in the morning, he's got like this big coat. And I said, where'd you get that coat? I've never seen a coat like that. It's like a special swimming coat. So the Buddha was like a coach for a sport or swimming. You can conceive of it that way. And if you go to a swimming lesson, you don't want to know what the chemical composition of the water is. Right? You don't want to know its resistance to your body, and you don't need to know all the muscles in your body. You need to know how to do a good stroke. And if you do a good stroke, you will be tested on your knowledge of swimming by whether or not you can swim. Whether when you go into the water and you jump in there and you start moving your body, you float and you don't sink. So there's very important teachings that the Buddha gives in the Pali Canon that say, what is a knowledgeable expert on the Dhamma? And the Buddha says, your acumen is excellent. You've asked this question, who's a knowledgeable expert on the Dhamma? And the Buddha says, whoever memorizes a 4-line gatha and practices in line with it, that person is a knowledgeable expert on the Dhamma. So in other words, the expertise that we have in the Buddha's teachings and its utility isn't knowing what's outside, it's in knowing how to swim. And the ocean here is the ocean that exists in all of our minds. It's essentially the world that we create, and whether we create it in such a way that we float, that we swim through it, or that we sink because of it. So the Buddha's given all of these teachings, all of these tools, to allow us to swim well, to allow us to navigate the world well, to allow us to create the world well. And if we take them on in this way, then they make perfect sense. Then there's no gaps in the teaching. The teachings are well elucidated. They're stripped of patchwork, but this is only something that makes sense if we practice them. Just like the breaststroke, the butterfly, okay, what is it? We can memorize that in a day. It makes sense to the people who can do them. That's when it gains its utility. And that's how Buddhism won't just be something where we say, come to the temple. It's nice, it's good, we're making good karma, but it becomes something that becomes increasingly special, increasingly unusual, something for which you wouldn't trade anything at all. So there's stories in the Pali Canon in which you'll find a monk who has everything going, or a young man who's got everything going for him. He's super rich, he's young and handsome, he's got like a wife, young wife, and really adores them. And they hear the Buddha's teachings and they give up their circle of relatives, large or small. They give up their wealth and they go forth from home life into homelessness, essentially into poverty. I was talking about, again with Ramo, about this biography of Ajahn Mun. And when you read the stories of monks who practice, actually it's a life of hardship to a certain extent. You don't sometimes get everything that you want or that you need. And that's the way that it works sometimes. And yet you meet some of these monks who've been practicing in this way, and they seem very, very happy. Or they seem very, very at ease. And so what is it that they've searched for, and what is it that they've found in the midst of hardship, in the midst of, say, the forest, in the midst of physical discomfort? So when we learn to take an item or a topic like our breath, and we learn to change the way that we use it so that our mind becomes balanced, what that tends to do is to change the way that we perceive the world, to change the world that we live in, and to change how we feel about it. Remember one time I was actually, I don't know if I showed him, I never showed him, but I had this kind of very big scar on my arm actually. It's like 50 or 60 stitches. It was really big. I was 16 years old. I used to like to climb trees and build these swings in them. I'd tie a rope from the tree. And okay, everybody's grimacing. I think people have an idea where this might end. It was a lot of fun. Well, it lasted. Anyway, I'd take a stick and tie it to the end of this rope. And I'd usually build these swings over top of like a kind of cliff. Get an idea of the kind of things that young boys get up to, and tie to the end of this tree. And then I'd run off the cliff and I'd grab the stick and swing around the tree. And you learn to do tricks doing that. You could kind of spin, and the rope would spin, and you'd spin around, and then you'd land with your feet on the other side as you'd circle the tree. There's all these kind of like tricks you could do. So one time, actually, my friend went on this swing that I'd made, and he's like, "The stick cracked." And I was like, "I don't believe you. You know, you're just insulting my swing." Like, I make the best swings. I'm a really good swing maker. The stick didn't crack. You know, I've been using these things forever. So anyways, the next time I went on it, the stick actually did crack, so I broke my wrist. So they did a surgery on my wrist in order to relieve the pressure. I developed this thing called compartment syndrome. And as a result, they put me on these like very, very heavy drugs, actually. Kind of very heavy drugs to dull the pain. I was kind of 16 years old. I remember they gave me this one drug, and they gave me the drug, and I would sit there looking at this TV. I'd be like, "Oh, this is really nice." I'm just sitting here looking at the TV. I felt, "Oh, this is really great." Perfectly fine looking at the TV because of whatever this drug had released into my system. And it's a good thing, I mean, that was only used in a hospital setting, because you can see like how powerful these drugs are. Now, if a person learns to balance their mind, if they learn to balance their emotional states, if they learn to pull their mind back from the external world to the internal world, and they learn to keep it in the present moment as they go through the day, as they wake up, as they fall asleep, then what can happen can be very unusual. Sometimes types of happiness can come welling up from, say, like the center of the chest or into the body that could completely overpower the feeling that one gets even from drugs. So the best type of feeling that one will have felt up until that point, and the cost of it is not physical. The cost is energy. The cost is time in bringing the mind inwards. Now, this type of happiness also grafts differently than the happiness of things that are external. If happiness of things that are external, we consume them, they give this big, immediate hit. Oh, we got the pizza. It's very good. Okay, right away. And then it slowly goes down. This other type of happiness comes in a different way. It starts small, and one has to pay a lot of attention to notice that it's even there. But the more that we cultivate it, the larger and larger that it grows. And if you get on the peak, if you get on the top in terms of your mind, then you can just maintain it. You don't have to climb the peak again. You have a greater control over the area of your mind. And if you can cultivate your mind in this way, then wherever you go, whatever you do will seem happy. It will seem easeful. So there's this sutta in which the Buddha speaks to Venerable Anuruddha. And Anuruddha is living in a forest. And he thinks these 8 thoughts of a great man. So kind of, a great man has mindfulness. A great man has effort. A great man delights in solitude. Doesn't delight in company. These are all these 8 thoughts of a great man. And he only thinks 7, actually. Then the Buddha disappears and reappears in front of him. So I've been listening to some talks that drove this point home. You can kind of imagine what it'd be like if you're just thinking something, like you're just in your kuti thinking something, or you're here thinking something, and all of a sudden the Buddha's there. Imagine that. It's like your teacher, whoa, he's just there. So it would make quite an impact. So he just appears in front of Venerable Anuruddha and he says, the thoughts that you've thought are good, these 7 thoughts, but add this 8th thought of a great man, that a great man delights in non-proliferation, which is nippapancha. Then he says, when you think these 8 thoughts of a great man, and you achieve the 4 jhanas, then your dwelling at the root of a tree will seem to you like a householder's mansion, plastered with many windows, many gables. He said, when you think these 8 thoughts of a great man and you develop the 4 jhanas, then your meal of alms food will seem to you like a big spread on a table full of curries and sauces. And when you think these 8 thoughts of a great man, when you cultivate the jhanas, then your rag robe will seem to you like a householder's cloth chest, with many beautiful types of clothing. So in other words, when the mind becomes beautiful, the world becomes an easeful place to live. It becomes a place which is easy to dwell in, which is easy to go through, because it's with our thoughts that we create the world, essentially. So the Buddha has this very cryptic phrase in the Dhammapada, and I remember again when I first came to Buddhism, they have all these different translations of the Dhammapada, and later I learned something about Pali. This one wasn't totally accurate, but what it said was, the very first verse in the Dhammapada in this translation was, we are what we think, all that we are arises with our thoughts we create the world. Mayan's smiling, she may not have read that. The actual one is that all phenomenon are led by mind, created by mind. Mind is their forerunner, essentially. Think or act with a pure mind, and happiness follows you like your shadow unshakable. And this is kind of the reverse as well. And I don't always get the words exactly right, but that's the general gist. So what the Buddha's saying there is, there's this word in Pali which is Dhamma. The word Dhamma can either mean, like, you have the mind and you have an external object. That's called a Dhamma. Or a Dhamma can mean anything at all. It just mean like any phenomena is a Dhamma. So I mean, this chair is a Dhamma. The cabinet is a Dhamma. So when we start to try to look for what exists in the external world and we come across a teaching like this, then what it can come to sound like is, oh, the whole world is empty. And when you go through these kind of very academic teachings, that's where they tend to end, at the very highest level. The whole world's an illusion, and we're creating it all. And you have to see and realize this illusion in order for your fetters to drop. So then people start to try to create that. They start to think in ways, how can I see the world as an illusion? They'll study various texts. How can I break the world up into these various components so that I can see it as an illusion? But the Buddha's teaching about the way that we create the world, again, is not pointing to the eye. It's pointing to the mouth and what we consume. Because the primary thing there is that whatever we experience in the world, we create. And if we create it from ignorance, then we get suffering. If we create it from knowledge, then we get happiness. And this is the way that dependent co-arising can really start to apply in our life. So we think that we may be doing something that's very simple when we just sit here to watch our breath, kind of like a carnival game. You kind of spend all of your mother's money trying to get the animal. And you try it and you fall away from the breath and then you come back again. And then next week you try it again and it seems like you're not making much progress. For people who want happiness, they have to learn to notice the difference between happiness that starts big and grows small, and the difference between happiness that starts small and grows big. We have to notice in our own minds, when the mind becomes peaceful, is it growing, even by a millimeter, even by a centimeter, even by an inch? And then we learn to expand that. We expand the range in which we stay in the present moment from just this session, or just this minute, to the time when we go to our car, to the time when we go to work, to the time when somebody says something insulting to us, Rather than just going up into our heads, oh, I'm angry or I'm anxious, we go to our bodies. What's this feel like, and how can I slow it down to bring the mind back in balance? And in doing this, our world starts to change, step by step, inch by inch, until it starts to change by a mile. It starts to change by several kilometers. Our world gradually starts to grow very different the more that we practice. And when we continue to develop our world in this way, when we continue to develop our mind in this way, there's shifts that can happen in the way that we evaluate what's important. Previously, we evaluated importance in terms of the I. Okay, what could I do to manipulate the 20 employees, the 30 employees? What can I do to get 300 people to manipulate? Right? But the more that we practice and the more this type of happiness grows, there starts to be this competition in the mind. And at a certain point, the importance can shift from the world outside to the world inside. And this is an internal shift that doesn't just happen intellectually. It's a shift in terms of where we put the weight of our happiness. And when a shift like that happens, it means that we're starting to build a refuge for ourselves. When we think of this word refuge, if we look at it through the I, as the Buddha is an external thing, the Dhamma is an external thing, the Sangha is an external thing, and they are external things. But where do they point? I mean, the Buddha in all of his actions was the great teacher. We should follow his actions. The Dhamma is his teachings, and we should follow them. And the Sangha is the people who've realized this, and again, they're to be gotten advice from and followed. So in the end, all of these things point back to us. They point back to our own happiness, our own suffering. And when our search for that shifts from external to finding a permanent source of food, then that refuge starts to become more and more real. All of the fears that people have, all of the worries that they have, all of the pains that they have are connected to something that they do. They're connected to something that they grab. They're connected to something that they consume. And so when we start searching for a way to be permanently happy, we look less and less to these things that we consume to try to find a way that we can be happy without consuming at all, without having to eat anything at all. And so the mind again begins to shift from seeing this type of thing as suffering to seeing it as peace, to seeing it as ease. So I remember, again, telling a lot of stories from my life today. There was this time when I was addicted to marijuana, when I was, again, trying to be this popular guy in high school. Everybody was smoking marijuana, excuse me. And all of my friends smoked marijuana. So at first I resisted it for a while. I never smoked cigarettes, by the way. That was something that I successfully resisted, and I'm glad about that, because quitting marijuana was hard enough. But when I was in the throes of this addiction to marijuana, then we would all go out, and we couldn't go see a movie without smoking marijuana. We couldn't, go anywhere without smoking. Marijuana always had to be there, otherwise it wasn't pleasant. Always had to have this marijuana, otherwise it was just a waste of time. So when we think about the way that the mind operates in terms of what it consumes, the more that a mind leans on something, the more that it consumes something external, the more difficult it is to imagine any type of happiness without it. Any type of happiness when it changes. Any type of happiness when it alters. But there is that type of happiness. And that type of happiness is to be achieved through letting go. So the Buddha's teachings, again, we look at them in terms of the I, we look at them in terms of the mouth. His teaching on constructing the world is not meant to lead us to search for an ontological truth or an experience that there's no self. What it's meant to lead us to do is to see what we're grabbing onto so that we can develop dispassion for whatever it is that we cling to that causes us to suffer. And behind that dispassion is release. Behind that dispassion is what we've been looking for. Behind that dispassion is something that doesn't have to change. So I was giving this talk last Wednesday, I think, kind of on the various levels of happiness. You've got the happiness from consumption, right, that you can consume. you've got the happiness that you get from stillness, from making the mind still. And then you have a happiness that you get from absence. You have a happiness that you get because things are not there. And when talking about this type of happiness, the moderator, I could see, she was asking me all these questions. Well, that's kind of hard to understand. Don't like the sound of that. Kind of happiness from absence. Doesn't sound very happy at all. It's not very good. And I remember one time, again, I was walking in Pickering, and this guy stopped me on the street. I was talking to him. And he was asking all about Buddhism. Well, what's the goal of Buddhism? Well, our goal is Nibbana. We're trying to achieve the end of suffering. Well, how do you do that? Well, you let go of all your desires and clingings. Well, I don't like the sound of that. Sounds like some kind of annihilation, like there's nothing there at all. It's just, you're destroyed and eliminated. So one of the things that happened in later Buddhist centuries, because people started to look more and more for the Buddhist teachings as an explanation of external truth, they tried to fill in the gaps more and more that they thought they saw in the suttas, was that people started to think that the Buddha was teaching that the end of the path is essentially that there's no self. So you're striving for a kind of annihilation almost. And when you do all this work and then you're annihilated at the end. You realize there's no self, you're annihilated. But when we look in the Sutta Pitaka, what we find is something very, very different. When the Buddha describes the self and what's not self, he doesn't talk about it through the eye. He talks about it through the stomach. What we do when we create the world is we create a self that inhabits it. And that is one of the central things in dependent origination. You have contact, something touches us. You have craving, you like it or you don't like it. Or you have feeling, you feel something, good, bad, or neutral. You have craving, you like it or you don't. You have clinging, you cling to it. And because of that clinging, you become something. You become somebody. Somebody who's at the peak of the job, the low part of the job, a popular person, an unpopular person. And as a result of becoming, you're pulled this way, pulled that way, pulled up, pulled down to the side. And just this clinging is suffering. That's what suffering is. So when the Buddha talks about the end of suffering, he doesn't talk about realizing an annihilation. He gives it in very cryptic statements in the canon. And the name that he tends to give, one of the ways in which it's experienced, is called Anidasana Vijnana, which means consciousness without surface. So the word Anidasana is like if you have a kind of space, you try to draw a picture in space, you can't draw it. Because, there's no surface. You could draw a picture on this window. Although it's see-through, it's clear, you can still draw a photo on it, or whatever you want on it. But in space, you can't draw it. So this word Anidasana Vijnana means a consciousness without surface. But still he describes it as a type of consciousness that is not known through the wateriness of water, not known through the fieriness of fire, not known through the earthiness of earth, the windiness of wind, or the allness of the all. So when a person looks to their internal world, when they cultivate their mind and try to see how they're creating it, the highest thing that they can develop is to know that whatever it is that their suffering comes from is that they're doing, something that they're doing. And when they develop this passion for this, then the links that bind them to the things that are outside get cut. And they get cut in phases. It's 4 distinct phases these things get cut. And once they're cut, you can imagine it like a kind of ball, like an earth, say. Imagine this ball has a metal core. This is a very rough analogy. I'm not trying to, the Buddha is the master of analogies. You can just imagine this as a rough analogy. Imagine this ball of very fertile earth that has a metal core. And wherever people put seeds on this ball, the seeds sprout and grow into a big tree. And these trees live and they die and various things happen to them. Sometimes they start on fire and the whole earth burns. Sometimes the earth gets renewed and various seeds start to grow. But if you remove a quarter of that earth, take it out, and all that remains is the metal core, then whatever seeds land on that metal don't take root. Whatever fire comes when the forest catches on fire can still dash against the surface, but it doesn't start anything on fire. There's nothing to burn there. And so for a person who's reached various levels of the path, who's reached the end of the path, their happiness is the happiness of absence because they're not touched by the things of the world. The things of the world they interact with, but they don't affect them. They're no longer touched. So when we think about peace, we think about happiness, what else could it be but that the things that cause us to suffer can no longer affect us? What else could it be but that we have a happiness, that it's independent, that it doesn't depend on conditions? And what else could it be than that? And this is what the Buddha's teachings point to. So long as we see them in this way, as we take the Sutta Pitaka as something to be practiced, as being like a kind of swimming lesson, and we get in the water and start to swim, judge our knowledge of the practice of Buddhism in general, by whether we sink in our minds or whether we can learn to float, then we're on a path that leads to things that we didn't imagine before. We're on a path that leads to happiness that we haven't experienced before. And in this way, we come to know, people can come to know for themselves just how special the Buddhist teachings are. And this is something that nobody can take away and that cannot be lost. So, focusing on the breath, getting here to listen to the Dhamma, and practicing together, look for those small ways in which happiness grows. Look for those small ways in which the mind becomes peaceful, and make them large. Make them grow. Make them strong until you don't need them either. And at that point, nothing in the world can affect you. Nothing in the world will contact you. And just this is the peace that we've been looking for.